afternoon, ladies and gentlemen and friends. Hi, I'm Jack Fowler. I'm the director of the Center for Civil Society at American Philanthropic. Welcome to this webinar. Let me just tell you a little bit about the center and about our participants, our esteemed participants, and the subject matter at hand. So the center is a new entity of American Philanthropic. I've written my notes down, I got to read from them. We were created earlier this year to find various ways to bring together givers, doers, and thinkers. Our intent is to strengthen civil society and to rekindle love and affection for things local. How are we going to do this? By webinars, conferences, master classes, publications. We intend to be a convening spot with a determination to help with the effectiveness of donors, charitable foundations, and nonprofit organizations. When civil society is strengthened, when our communities are reinvigorated and restored, America flourishes, and that wonderful, unalienable right, the pursuit of happiness, is a less arduous thing. Today is our first webinar of the center. It's titled, "Who Will Save American History?" And that question is something to be unpacked. It implies there is such a thing as an American history. And then it says it must be under duress, right? Because it needs to be saved. Who is attacking it and who's going to save it? So these are all worthwhile things to look at, and it's very worthwhile to look at them through the eyes and through the wisdom of the three wonderful participants we have today in this webinar. And I will give them their names and a little brief description of them in alphabetical order. They are Jonathan Greenberg. Jonathan is the executive director at the Jack Miller Family Foundation. The executive director of the Jack Miller Freedom Initiative at the Jack Miller Family Foundation. He's the former vice president of external relations at the Illinois Policy Institute, and he's the former Midwest political director of AIPAC. David Harmer is the president and CEO of the Freedoms Foundation of Valley Forge. It is a storied institution in a storied location. David asked, he kind of implied, he probably is better known by people he's related to. He is the son of the former lieutenant governor of California under Ronald Reagan, Governor Ronald Reagan, John Harmer. He's also the father-in-law of Mccullough, is that how you say, Mccullough Skinner? And back in a few weeks ago at the Olympics, she was busy winning the silver medal in the women's gymnastics for the vault. And one little note, young David was known for raiding Governor Ronald Reagan's jelly bean jar. And the third participant is Wilfred McClay. Bill McClay is a professor of history at Hillsdale College. He just started teaching there this year. He didn't just start teaching this year, though. Bill previously held the Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma. He is a historian of much esteem and the author of many books, many important books. And I'm going to show you one, and we're going to quote from it in a minute. And that's Land of Hope, an invitation to the great American story. Jonathan has a copy. David told us earlier that he distributes this book widely. So Bill McClay has some of his best royalty subjects here with him today. So today, let's begin our conversation about who will save American history with an American historian. That's with Bill. Bill, you write histories. You come at them, you start them with some perspective. I'm going to say there's an opportunity cost here, right? There are things you include and there are things you don't include. Some things you don't include because who cares what happened in Boise, Idaho in 1702? Nothing against Boise, folks. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't even come into contemplation, but there are some things subjectively not considered. So Bill, as a historian, how do you approach writing history? And then I want to get into some of the aspects of good history and bad history as applies to American history. And you have to unmute yourself, Bill. You're muted.
I need to unmute myself.
Thank
you,
Terrific.
Jack. And thank you for having me. thanks to my fellow panelists, thanks to those of you who are watching, and American Philanthropic for this initiative, which this is the first time I've heard an explanation of the larger project. This sounds great. I think it's absolutely fantastic because a lot of what we need to do is revitalize more local, regional forms of association, and not think everything has to be done on a national level, because that's part of our problem. Anyway, yeah, as to your question, I think that one thing to begin with is that history is always written with a particular audience in mind, with a particular intentions in mind, not necessarily to prove something or make an argument, but that what you want to do is get at what's most meaningful and most needful. And when I wrote Land of Hope, I really was thinking about it's several generations now of students, high school students, who had whose principal association with American history or exposure to it was through books like Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, which is a really awful book, and actually most professional historians will admit that. But it carries the water for the left very well, very effectively, and he tells it as a story. It's a caricature. It's a cartoonish story. You might as well have white hats and black hats, and plutocrats against the noble, horny-handed workers and that sort of thing. But the history is much more complicated, more rich, and also more nourishing to us than that. And especially when you're thinking about young people who are going to be, we hope, active citizens of this country. What ought to be part of their education for citizenship, and what role does history play in that, and what kind of history, what kind of approach to history should we take? I think it goes without saying, but it needs to be said, that we don't want a whitewash, we don't want a sanitized version of our past. That's not what we are about. We are part of our project, the liberal project of America, and I mean liberal in the best sense of the word, involves self-criticism at every step of the way. We are reflective in that sense on ourselves. So this is not a question of pumping young people up with a kind of inflated go get them story of American exceptionalism as a form of perfection. But what they need is the tools for citizenship, and they need a sense of membership. This is one of the things that I stress a lot, and that I get from for sources as varied as Burke and Roger Scruton, who talked a lot about this in his career, that citizenship is membership. It's connection to not just a particular entity in the present moment, but that entity in time, including the ancestors, including the predecessors, including the people who in some way made possible the circumstances we live in now. So, and that may include people for whom we blame for some of the circumstances we're in now. That's part of the historical consciousness. It's part of constant sifting of the past. So I don't present the past as a entirely settled story, but I think some elements of it are and have to be if we're going to move forward in the institutional structures that we have. So again, part of your question is, what do you leave out, or what do you emphasize, maybe, as a positive way of putting it? I felt it was really important in Land of Hope to emphasize political history. Most historians have been doing other kinds of history for the last 30 years. I mean, professional historians, academic historians, the people at Columbia, Stanford, Chicago, Harvard, Yale, et cetera, and the big state universities, research-oriented institutions. Social history, cultural history, increasingly the histories of various marginalized groups, and some of which I think were overdue for a more intensive and sympathetic historical examination, some of which may be less worthy. But the big picture has been lacking. Students come out of high school, they come out of college, they come out of a reading of any textbook more confused, dazed and confused, as the old Led Zeppelin song, then informed and fortified for wholehearted defense of what is good and what is inestimably good in their civilization. So that's the small task that I took on for myself with Land of Hope, is to try to be a force to push back against that, and not arguing for the purity and quality of American history, although I do talk about that. I do put that out as something that.
Let me.
But more as a big picture within which people can then begin to operate.
Bill, I'm going to ask you, first of all, I want to let people know if they have questions, they can submit them, and the great Maria Donselmi, who's invisible here right now, will weed through them, and maybe we will have time to bring them up later. Bill, I'm going to ask you a question now, and you can answer it later, because we're going to get to David right now, but I would like you to spend a little time, when I get back to you, just explain that arc of history, let's say over the last 2 generations, how history has been pursued, and how bad history, I'm making an assumption here, how bad history can be harmful to America. A bad history of Major League Baseball will not be harmful to America. A bad history of American history may indeed be harmful. But you about that, I'm going to bring David in. So David, I want to give you this image. We're in the ground floor. We're taking the long elevator ride up to the top of the Empire State Building. You even have to change floors, I think, to change elevators to get there. I want you to talk about the Freedoms Foundation of Valley Forge, its origin and its location. I think both are very storied and historic. So give us a sense of its founding and its specialness, and then also give us an idea of no pandemics happening. There's no lockdown, there's none of that. Talk about the day-to-day operations, how it's done, who's being brought in, what are they being taught, and we'll get later separate questions to the actual your view on the consequences of how Freedoms Foundation of Valley Forge. I don't want to shortcut. I don't want to say Freedoms Foundation. I think it's very important that Valley Forge be in there. Its consequence. Anyway, we're in the elevator. We're pressing 102. It's going up. Start.
Jack, thank you. Freedoms Foundation at Valley Forge was established in 1949, 72 years ago, by a group of concerned citizens, some of whose names our listeners may recognize. E.F. Hutton, founder of the eponymous brokerage, Don Belding of Foote, Cone & Belding, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was in between gigs, saving the free world as Supreme Allied Commander and leading it as president. These citizens were concerned, even back then in the wake of World War II, that Americans were pretty clear about what they were against, Nazism, fascism, so on, but not so clear about what they were for. What was it about the American way of life that was worth the tremendous sacrifices of World War II to preserve? So they established Freedoms Foundation at Valley Forge to create and build an understanding of America's founding ideals as reflected in her founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. They acquired a magnificent 75-acre campus, from which I'm speaking to you now, in Valley Forge. We share a property line with the National Park Service. Our neighbor is Valley Forge National Historical Park. A 5-minute walk from my office through the woods is the Isaac Potts home, which served as General Washington's headquarters during that terrible winter of 1777 to 78. During the school year, we bring high school students from around the country to our campus for multi-day residential, immersive, intensive educational programs in the history and ideals and continuing relevance of the American founding. During the summer, we do the same thing for K-12 teachers. We bring them here for college-accredited, graduate-level professional development courses, looking at how vital America's founding ideals remain.
David, I'm going to get back to you later. You have an assignment just like Bill does, but I want you, when we return later, to talk about the site itself and the role it has in the impact. I'll repeat the question later, but I guess you could take what you do on the road and rent out a hotel somewhere in an airport area for a couple of days and teach what you teach. But I have a feeling that where you are has some sort of indelibleness, if that's a word, to the mission. But we'll get back to that shortly. I'd like to bring in now, last but not least, Jonathan Greenberg. Jonathan, you're doing terrific stuff with the Family Foundation. The Jack Miller Family Foundation does not only care about civic education, it has other interests in medicine and Jewish affairs and Jewish religious matters. But I'd like you, Jonathan, to tell us briefly about the passion that Jack Miller, who's still kicking and kicking hard, the passion he has for civic education.
Yeah, so Jack is the founder and retired CEO of Quill, the office supply company. Jack made a lot of money, one paperclip at a time, and he started his company in the back room of his dad's poultry shop with a telephone and a lot of hard work, and turned it into a huge company, employed, provided a livelihood for thousands of people. And Jack understands that America allowed him to do that, and the founding principles of this country are what permitted Jack to succeed to the best of his ability, to the best of his willingness to work hard. And he wants his kids and grandkids and great grandkids to do the same. Jack's 92 now, still in the office every day at 9 o'clock. And he's still, I think he's watching this from downstairs here in the office. So he's still here. He's that work ethic that made him a wealthy man is now leveraged in the service of the propagation of America's founding principles and history.
So Jonathan, just for I'll have maybe a three-part question here or just explain so we're clear that I think many people know the Jack Miller Center. There's a difference between the Jack Miller Center and the Jack Miller Family Foundation. That's one thing. The other thing is, at the Jack Miller Center, on its annual report, you will see emblazoned on the top of the front page, the battle for the soul of our nation will be won or lost in our classrooms. Later, I have an assignment for you. We'll get back later to this wonderful thing you're doing with the American Civics and History Initiative. I'm going to want you to speak about that at some length. But so you're on the front lines, you're in the parapets, the ramparts of this fight to save American history. Who's winning? Who's the we? Who's winning? Who's losing? And if there's a we here, and I assume we're part of the we, maybe on the losing side right now, is there a chance of turning this around? What's your assessment of the war, the battle to save the soul of our nation?
So I'll start with the Jack Miller Center. The Jack Miller Center is a provider organization. They work with university faculty all over the country. They've built a network of I think it's almost now, or maybe even over 1,000, mostly political theorists, but also some historians and some economists on 300 campuses around the country. Bill McClay, we're lucky to have Bill McClay as a member of the board of the Jack Miller Center. And then a few years ago, they got into the business of leveraging those relationships with college professors to help teach high school teachers to be better civics teachers. And so that's the work that they do. And the Jack Miller Family Foundation is the largest single funder of the Jack Miller Center, but it's a charitable foundation. And I work for the foundation, although I do everything that I can to help with the Jack Miller Center, because obviously that work is important to me and to my boss. As to who's winning, we all saw last summer, I think, who's winning. And it's not America. That doesn't mean that all is lost. I don't think we'd be having this conversation if all was lost, but it does mean that we're losing. And I think a big part of the reason that we're losing is that those of us who had a responsibility for institutional maintenance spent the last, I don't know, however many decades failing to maintain American institutions. And those institutions were taken over by activists who wanted to undermine certain things about America, and they've done a great job. The long march through the institutions, I think, has been largely successful. And the way Jack describes that is, it isn't that we lost, it's that we didn't suit up. One side was on the field playing, and I won't use the colorful language Jack usually uses. It's a family program, but the rest of us were sitting in the bleachers complaining. And so Jack's the promise that Jack has made in the years that he has left and beyond is to make sure that our side has the resources and competence and ability and energy to finally suit up and get a team on the field.
Jonathan, I'm pointing out here, some people might be able to see that's an old Bill Buckley poster. Bill ran for mayor in 1965 in New York, and I was the publisher of National Review. I worked there 30 years, and Bill was a friend. Bill came to fame in America in 1951 when he wrote God and Man at Yale. So the issues of our institutions and the march through our institutions begin. They're 70 plus years old. Oh, there you go. Okay. You've spent a lot of money on books. I like that. Let's go back to our friend Bill McClay. Bill, would you give us now that kind of a history on history, a brief look at what has actually been the arc of how historians write, or more so how professors and high school teachers and grade school teachers teach history 2 generations ago to the point we're at today?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated answer. Let me just quickly say express my admiration for Jack Miller. I mean, this is a guy who's made a bundle. He could spend the rest of his days just hanging out in Florida in his beautiful home, which I've been privileged to be in a few times. And instead, he wants to save America. This is great. I mean, this is a great man. He really is, and surprisingly humble for somebody who is self-made to that degree. Anyway, I just wanted to say that. Bad history, has enormous influence, and it's I think there's a way that you can compare it to the bad history. If an individual person is brought up with a bad history, that is a sense of their ancestors as being scurrilous rogues and people of no account, and history, whether it's personal history or national history, is the foundation of identity, and that's where we get our sense of who we are. And our rituals, religious rituals of Seder, these are identity-focused rituals. They're ways in which the past is seen as the foundation of who and what we are. So if you have a lousy past, or if you think you have a lousy past that's full of shame, that's full of degradation, that's full of oppression, that has where you have to, sort of apologize for your very existence, this is not good. This is not healthy. And I think that's what the last couple generations of American high school and college students have gotten. Not that, there's actually a lot of very good historians who do. The problem is that they do their very good work in little tiny areas that don't easily lend themselves to larger interpretations. And if you ask historians, don't you think what you guys have been doing for the last 30 years or so or more is having an effect on the public mind, on people's sense of the country? They say, well, that's not my problem. That's not my responsibility. I just write my history, and I'm writing for other members of the historical guild. So there's no attention paid anymore to what that larger arc, what that larger story is. When you introduced David, you used twice the word story. You said that Valley Forge is a storied institution. And that sense of something really great and noble, having a story behind it, is one of the things that ought to guide the way we think about history, that history is that sort of foundational story. And I have said this repeatedly, that I think if you look at the really frightening statistics about pathologies among young people, youth suicide is up 60% in the age group 10 to 24 years old. That is a horrifying statistic. And I'm not saying it's all because of bad history, but I'm saying bad history contributes to that. If you have the sense that the nation you're inhabiting, the world you're inhabiting, has nothing good to be said about its past, and has really no future either, your prospects in life are pretty dim. One last thing I'll mention in this is Jonathan has a picture of Lincoln behind him to his right, and I love everybody's pictures. I just have a blank wall, but Lincoln didn't read a lot of history as a young man, but he did read Weems's biography of George Washington, which was published in 1799, the year of his death, and it's not very reliable on some details. Washington and the cherry tree, that story, for example, he just kind of made it up. But the accounts of the battles are pretty accurate. And Lincoln, after he was elected, he was on his way to Washington from Springfield for the inauguration. He stopped over in New Jersey and gave a speech to the New Jersey State Senate, in which he's in Trenton. So he said, "Look, I as a boy, I read about the Battle of Trenton in Weems's biography of Washington. And all of that, I'm paraphrasing here, but all of that has stayed with me, as do the things that you as a young person, those stories that are sort of burned into your soul, they become a kind of template through which you view the world." And he said, "I knew even then that as a young boy, that those people that fought at Trenton were fighting for something more than sort of immediate victory in battle, but they were fighting for principles of liberty and the constitutional order, yet to be, of course, instituted, but on the way. They were fighting for something much larger than themselves, much larger than their own country." So that's what a good history can do. Lincoln had that sense, the Gettysburg Address. Remember how it begins. It doesn't begin like with an invocation of the future. It begins with the past, 77 years ago, and the worthiness of what the fathers did. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, and the purpose of the war is to be the custodians, the defenders, in a time of testing of that legacy. So that's what good history can do. It can heal you for the hard times.
That leads to another assignment. We'll get back to you, but think about this when I'm going to be following up with David next. Are there, because not everyone is in a classroom, most Americans will never see the inside of a classroom again. But they have come under the spell of the Howard Zinns and the others you've mentioned. So think about 2 or 3 worthwhile histories. They don't have to be new books. They could be classics or old or whatever sense that you would maybe recommend for interested people to read and maybe even to pass on to others. I know for myself, I can't tell you how many copies of Whitaker Chambers' Witness I have bought and shared with people. I mean, it's a slice of American history, but I think you may help inspire some of our viewers today. David, following up on what I raised with you earlier, I mean, you are at this very special site. Again, you could teach your programming, I guess you could contour it to a road show, but you are where you are. It's a special place. Does it have a particular resonance? Does it leave something indelible in what you're doing that you wouldn't get if you weren't at Valley Forge? And then
Yes.
second, David, I do want to get a sense, how many people in a good year, again, non-pandemic year, how many students and teachers are involved in the programming?
Thank you, Jack. With respect to the first question, yes, it does. Now, to be clear, we are fans of great civic education, however, wherever, and by whomever provided. As we see now, I'm happy to do my little part to advance it online. We salute our allied organizations that provide online resources or go out to other campuses. But we have found that there is something special about being where history happened. And in fact, here we're within a few minutes of the crucible of the American Revolution, where Washington and the Continental Army very, very nearly lost the American Revolution before it succeeded, but whereby, thanks to Washington's character, they persevered. When we bring students here, they're not merely informed, they are transformed. This is holy ground. There's a spirit about it. And being where those sacrifices occurred compels people to experience a little something of what those long-suffering soldiers experienced. It makes real the price they paid for the liberties we inherited as gifts of grace. With respect to your second question, pre-pandemic, we typically served about 2,600 students and about 400 teachers a year in groups of typically 40 to 100 at a time, in sessions lasting from 4 to 6 days at a time. Our campus has a boys and girls dorm, dining hall, classrooms, a chapel, complete facilities to accommodate intensive immersive residential programs.
And is that sort of the capacity for what you could do, or is it any more scalable? I hate the word scalable, but I'm going to use it again. I'm sorry, it's going to come again, but is it?
No, we operate nowhere near capacity, and we would welcome benefactors who would help us give this experience to more students and more teachers.
Terrific. Okay. Jonathan, I'm going to follow up with you in a second, but I have to give a commercial here I just would like to let our viewers know that the Center for Civil Society is having a conference. It's mostly for about givers, but it's Restoring American Community, November 17th in Scottsdale. The Center for www, you have to type that, www.centerforcivilsociety.com. You'll find out more about that wonderful event there. And then we have another webinar coming up on October 18th, Should Philanthropies Be Permanent? That will feature Dick DeVos, yes, that Dick DeVos, Heather Higgins, and Bill McClay's colleague at Hillsdale, John J. Miller, who runs the journalism program there. And John has lots of, he's got a black belt in this issue of philanthropy permanence. So please check them out, folks. And if you have questions, submit them, and Maria will vet them and send forward. Now, Jonathan, want to get back to the American Civics and History Initiative. So what part of the ultimate question here for this webinar today is, who will save American history? I think we believe there is an American history. It needs saving. And David just discussed one aspect of the saving. Jonathan, you're involved in, I think, a really inspiring, if I dare say, amazing, heartening program, this ACHI. So I'm going to read my note here. I think it's fair to say it is an example of the WHO trying to save, and it's maybe even saving more than American history. You have a broader battle for the American soul that kind of transcends American history. But would you tell us about what this program is, where it's taking place, and later I'll ask you about its scalability in other places. And it's a partnership. It's a partnership between the Jack Miller Family Foundation, but some other organizations. And that's not always, I think, the easiest thing to try to pull off, but it seems you are pulling it off. So talk about the American Civics and History Initiative.
Thanks, Jack. So a little over 2 years ago, we had a meeting here at Jack's offices where we brought together almost 40 provider organizations and funders to talk about what to do about this problem. And that's before the riots from the summer of 2020 and kind of before this achieved critical mass in the popular imagination. So what came out of that was that we needed better teaching. American civics, American history, American political theory, American economic theory all needed better teaching. And they needed better teaching not by the time kids matriculated to college. By that time, really, it's almost too late to create perceptions about what America is and could be in kids. And besides, only 30% of American kids go to college. So then you've got a majority of your electorate that wouldn't have access to it if you waited until college to do it. So the decision was that K through 12 civic education needed a significant amount of work on creating teachers who were content experts. A big part of the problem is you can become a teacher with very little content expertise, really almost no content expertise. You'll be an expert in theory and pedagogy, but you won't be necessarily an expert in content. And especially in the area of civics, where there aren't really right or wrong. I mean, in math and science, there are right and wrong answers. Civics requires, some discussion. You have to tease out of kids why they feel the way they feel, why they think what they think. And that requires a good deal of content expertise. And we didn't feel like the American Teaching Corps had, for the most part, had that. So Jack's belief was an investment in teacher training was something that was really important. And too often in our world, there are a number of organizations that do great work, but they operate in silos, and they do either complementary work or very similar work, but they operate in silos. And so Jack, who is the chairman of the board of the Jack Miller Center, reached out to our friends at the Ashbrook Center and our friends at the Bill of Rights Institute and asked if they would join us in a collaborative effort to increase the availability of high quality content-based teacher training. And we decided to focus on Florida to start out with for a couple of reasons. First of all, Jack's a Florida resident now. And so, it's home for Jack. That was one reason. Political leadership was another, though. Ron DeSantis, as far as I know, is the only governor who explicitly ran on improving civic education in his state. I'll bet you there are going to be a lot more gubernatorial candidates. There already are. Glenn Youngkin in Virginia is running on this, but there will be a lot more of them running on it this time. But Governor DeSantis ran when he first ran on a platform that explicitly called for improvements in civics. So that was another reason. The third reason is it's a large state. It's a diverse state. It's not just racially diverse. It's also geographically diverse. There are large blue cities and big blue groups of counties and everything in between, big red counties and everything in between. And so we decided that it was kind of a perfect place to try to start doing this. And we've been doing it now for a year. The practitioner organizations, even with COVID, have achieved, I think, tremendous success. We had a target of increasing about 2,500 new teachers. Each of the three organizations kind of put the teachers they already have relationships with on the table. And we decided that we wanted to get 50% of the way to all the rest of the teachers in Florida. And in the first year of a 2-year program, we've hit our mark, even with COVID not allowing us to do things in person. So it's been tremendous success. Now, the ultimate impact of that isn't measurable in terms of how many teachers we get in the door, right? The ultimate impact is in what those teachers take back to their classrooms, what those teachers teach their kids, and what those kids learn and how they go out and act. So Jack has chosen a generational solution, but that's the only way to attack this. I mean, I'm sure there are more immediate solutions that might scratch itches for some people, but really we didn't dig ourselves into this quickly. This was a generational slide into the problem that we have, and the only solution is a generational solution to get out. And so that's what we've done, and it's working. And we'll work on ways to measure the actual impact and the teaching that teachers are taking back. But we really think this is as Jack says, and as you referred to, the battle for the soul of the nation is won or lost in the classroom, and who's standing at the front of the classroom.
Yeah. I'm calling an audible here, and then I'm going to go to Bill for his history book recommendations. Jonathan, there is some teacher certification aspect to this program,
Sure.
right, in Florida. And is this something that is just being funded by the Jack Miller Family Foundation? I'm curious if there's been any outreach to other philanthropists and trying to be apostles for this idea of this is where we need to invest to change America in this kind capacity, this age range. Why are you giving to colleges? Sorry, Bill, nothing wrong with people giving to colleges, especially if it's Hillsdale. But opportunity cost of conservative, we'll call it conservative, patriotic philanthropy dollars, maybe misspent in some ways than others. So apostleship and certification.
So I'll zoom out from certification and talk about policy generally. So
Okay.
The American Civics and History Initiative, which is a collaborative effort of the Jack Miller Center, Ashbrook Center, and the Bill of Rights Institute, doesn't deal in policy at all. Right. Separately, I've done some work in Florida and some other places on some policies that we believe will help incentivize the kind of professional development that we're dealing with. Teaching is like any other profession. There are really good teachers and really bad teachers and a big group of people in the middle. The really good teachers are going to take every professional development that's available to them because they're dorks like me. The really bad teachers aren't going to take anything no matter what you do. It's the group in the middle that we need to get. We need to find ways to incentivize them to do it. And so there are a number of things the DeSantis administration proposed. It didn't pass in the last session because they proposed it in the last week, but we're hopeful that it will next session. Proposed something called the Florida Seal of Civics Excellence. And the idea there is that you associate the proposal is $3,000 a year. We'll see what ends up passing, but a $3,000 a year pay increase for teachers who take a certain number of approved content-based professional development courses. And so there you're providing a market incentive for teachers to participate in this kind of professional development. We have a real problem in that we turn out kids from schools of education that have tenured faculty that are overwhelmingly focused on pedagogy. Right. And then we send them back. We incentivize them to go back for a master's degree in the same pedagogy. And while they're there, they pick up critical race theory and they pick up all kinds of other bad things that they then bring into the class. Why not, instead of, I would love to see teachers, the way we certify teachers change too, but why not, instead of incentivizing kids who want to be teachers, nobody starts out thinking they want to be a bad teacher. So why not, instead of incentivizing them to go through these woke factories, incentivize them to take high quality content-based professional development? So that's the policy answer. In terms of who's funding it and creating apostles, it is not entirely funded at all by the Jack Miller Family Foundation. We're still raising money for the second year in Florida, and anybody who's interested in participating with Jack should absolutely reach out to me. Jack's put a lot of his own resources into this, obviously. We're grateful to have a number of other partners. I actually don't know if I'm allowed to name any of them, so I won't. But we have other partners, and we're looking for more. And I will say this: I know you want to talk about scalability later, but I will say that when this moves out to other states, I guess I'm foreshadowing the answer to your scalability question.
We have 5 minutes left, so why don't you quickly say about what next steps there are, if you can.
So sure, yeah. So quickly. We know Texas is one of the next states. There will probably be some other states that will come next. When we move out to other states, I really want to see as much of the funding for these states come from those states as possible. So it's Florida dollars paying for Florida kids and Texas dollars paying for Texas kids and so forth and so on. There's no state funding of this at all, which I can tell you when we talk to governors, they like a lot. But this is the idea here is to fund this all through charitable dollars, and as much of it as possible in the states. That's not to say that we won't take non-Florida dollars for the remainder of the Florida plan. And I should say this costs, it's about $1.5 million for 2 years in Florida. It's actually relatively low cost.
And how many teachers have been touched by this?
So it's over 1,000 in the first year. By the end of the 2-year program, it'll be 2,500 new teachers. So
Okay.
so some of the teachers that will have participated in programs were already teachers. Those A+ teachers that the 3 organizations had relationships with, they don't count. We're interested in who's new in the door, and that'll be 2,500 new teachers.
I think I created a heart attack for some of my colleagues. I said there were 5 minutes, but really 15. I didn't know that 45. I thought there were only 50 minutes in an hour. I had a bad math teacher.
See, you need someone who had content-based professional development.
Right, the pedagogy. Well, let's go to Bill. Bill, I do have a question from one of the viewers, but then I'm not going to let you off the hook for the other thing. Well, give us some ideas, 2 or 3 books that you might recommend, other history books that you think are good in their own and counteract some of these the bad trends we've had in the last few decades. And then the question I have is, what are some of the primary barriers right now to good civics ed in classrooms? I'll throw that open. You get to crack at it first, Bill. So Bill, history books and that question. You're muted, Bill.
In general, I think that biographies are one of the most appealing ways, particularly of figures like Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln and so on. And so I'd say, with Washington, you've got an abundance of good biographies, although I'm not sure anybody really cracks the man. But Flexner, the famous Indispensable Man biography, and Edmund Morgan has a much overlooked book called The Genius of George Washington, a little thin book that's awfully good, awfully interesting. Doesn't give you a lot of a sense of the man, but sort of how he operated, ideas and so on. There's a bunch of others. Ron Chernow, who did the Hamilton biography, also has written about Washington. Very good stuff. David Mccullough, almost anything of David Mccullough is, and I'm thinking about, just a pleasure to read.
Right.
His biography of John Adams was superb, and it took a figure that is not one of the obvious heroes of American history, early American history, and really gave him a spotlight. And there are other, so many books that McCullough's done about the Brooklyn Bridge, about the Johnstown flood, the new book on the pioneers. All of that is, and the pioneers book, by the way, has been raked over the coals by the professional historians because it's not negative enough about westward expansion. It's too willing to see the heroics and in the explorers of the West. So, it's really hard to this sort of political correctness that envelops us is really hard to avoid. Let me suggest also a name. This is a sort of blast from the past name, but there's a enormously gifted and creative historian who sort of was blackballed by the profession, named Daniel Borsten. Daniel Borsten was, and he was blackballed because this relates to Chambers. He had been a member of the Communist Party when he was a student at Harvard, and then he testified about some of his experiences, and he's never been forgiven for that. But he wrote wonderful books, and there's a trilogy called The Americans that I strongly recommend. It's old now, and he's long gone, but it's just a wonderfully rich, and it's full of innovations in material culture, the way that Americans live, the kinds of democratic housing, and all of these, and the role of ideas in American history. It's very, very good, and just a wonderful read. And there's still, if we go back even further, there's an excellent textbook that Henry Steele Commander and
Right.
Samuel Eliot Morison did, which I think it's called The Growth of the American Republic. But that's still worth reading, although you have to, after 1960, when they start actually showing the lyrics of the song Camelot, you really need to kind of have a little bit of a skeptical view. They were a little Kennedy besotted.
Yeah.
But for the earlier part of American history, particularly the early explorations, especially for Columbus, about whom Morrison wrote extensively, very good stuff, and really restores a sense of the adventure of American history. And it was a tremendous adventure. So just off the top of my head, those are some books. Anything, by the way, by Gordon Wood, who is probably the most eminent living historian of the United States, I think is good. He's reliable. He knows everything about the subject, and it writes in a beautiful, accessible way. I admire him tremendously.
I need to improvise with David. Since your Freedom's Foundation Valley Forge is teaching, what are some of the books you are using, other than, in addition to Bill's book, A Land of Hope? What books are you using in the programs there?
Well, let me back up just a bit, if you don't mind.
Sure, go ahead, David.
Well, one of our guests asked, if I remember the question correctly, what are the primary barriers to quality civic education?
Yeah, go ahead, take that on.
And because it's so important to us, I'd like to speak to that.
Go ahead.
Let me share a friend forwarded to me a tweet from the National Park Service. This came out 2 days ago, Saturday the 18th. Jonathan's nodding, so he's seen this.
Oh yeah.
Ford's Theater, National Park Service. Direct quote here. Do you ever feel we as a nation put Abraham Lincoln on a pedestal? What do you think might be a more useful, more complex, or more realistic way to think about or memorialize the 16th president? Well, let me give a message to the moral pygmies of the National Park Service. Yes, he does deserve to be on a pedestal. Yes, we're putting him there. Now, the answer to bad history is not hagiographic history. The answer is accurate history. But we're confident enough in the value of the ideals of the American founding that we're happy to provide accurate history, warts and all, trusting that that history is inspiring. The founding ideals were so sweeping, so universal, so ambitious that, of course, no society could perfectly realize them. But the American story has been one of consistently striving to realize them. That's a history worth celebrating. But if the very entity charged with serving as custodian of that history denigrates it, who's going to support it? If of all places, Ford's Theater, where Lincoln was assassinated, can't stand up for the man, who will? The biggest barrier to teaching civic education well in the classroom is the culture smog that surrounds it. So that's why we care so much about providing an antidote.
Jonathan, do you want to add to that in any way, or are you going to high five David?
Well, both. So I'll absolutely high five that. I think the best response that I saw to that tweet, and I don't remember who said it, but it was somebody noted that it wasn't the first time that Lincoln had been assassinated at Ford's Theater. That's
great. Yeah.
So I agree. I think that's a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, which is a failure of institutional maintenance. That if the people who are in charge of running the sites of our heroes can't defend our heroes, what really are we doing? I would just say, in addition to that, in terms of what the barriers are, I think it's just will. I think that there's a lack of will, a lack of willingness to stand up and say that this is something that is good, that America is good, America is a great achievement in human history, and it should be defended. And Reagan called it that there was in his last speech from the Oval Office the night before George H.W. Bush was sworn in, he talked about parents not wanting to teach their kids an unambivalent love of America, and I think that's a cultural problem that really has to change. It's a hearts and minds in each of our homes problem, and I think that's
I think we may have. Well, Jonathan seems to.
No, I'm back.
You're still there? Okay, something hinky
I
happened.
don't know what.
Well,
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, we have about 5 minutes now. Now we really do have about 5 minutes, and this kills me because I love George Nash, the great George, and George is watching, and he's asked a question: are there any great?
Oh, wow.
films? Yeah, well, he's the best. Are there any great
Yes.
films, including documentaries, that might reach the rising generation? And I kind of feel, I wish I knew that in advance. I want to spring it on you, but I'll tell you what, let's give you each 1 minute to wrap up your own thoughts on this. Who will save American history? That's a question. You can restate things you've already said, but let's start with you, Bill, 1 minute each, and then jump ball on George's thing. Maybe we can end with, if anyone has any thoughts on that. Go ahead, Bill.
This will be amazing if I can say this in 1 minute, but I think a big part of the problem is that the professionals, and this National Archives thing is a perfect example, or whoever it was at Ford Theater, I guess it was the archives, right? They play to one another. They play, professional cliques play to one another. The historians write for the historians. The archivists are arguing for the other archivists. I became aware of this problem when during the Enola Gay controversy, which some of you may remember, that the Smithsonian put on a commemoration of the dropping of the atomic bomb, and it was atrocious. It was actually organized by someone I went to graduate school with, who didn't even have any expertise in the field. But it was really geared towards the world of museum professionals, not toward the public. This problem exists everywhere. Journalism, the journalists write for one another. The Post, the Times, they write for one another. They don't write for the larger American public. So I think, thank God, the American people still have a sense of their history in their bones, and I think we need to support that. That, I think, is one of the things to be hopeful about.
Okay, David?
Jack, let me offer just an illustration of what happens here. We may not be able to solve the problem, but I'll tell you what, every year we can create about 2,600 students and about 400 teachers who become disciples of the American experiment. We're the gateway drug for the freedom movement. We don't put any ideological or partisan filters on applicants. And so we get a pretty broad cross-section. And I think, like the profession as a whole, our teachers probably tend to lean left. Each summer, among those who participate in presenting our programs are the living recipients of the Congressional Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor in action against an enemy force. There are only 67 living recipients. One of them is Woody Williams, who received the Medal of Honor for his valor in World War II, fighting his way to the top of Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima. Well, for a program where Woody Williams was speaking, we had a teacher who was clearly not a fan of the American military, wearing a tie-dye shirt, Birkenstocks, frizzy hair, made his views pretty well clear, and they weren't rooted in the ideals of the American founding, let's say. By the end of Woody's presentation, this guy was in tears, and he came up and the two of them embraced. We don't tell people what to believe. We just tell them what happened here, what the American Revolution enabled and led to, what it was fought for, and what's been done with those ideals since. And that's enough. Again, they're not just informed, they're transformed. So our mission is to create worthy disciples of the American experiment, and we do.
So you're saving it too. And then Jonathan, you're on mute. And Jonathan, who will save American history?
The same people who began it. or at least the same kind of people who began at a small committed band of people who know that it's there's a better way to do things and who are willing to fight for it.
You know, to listener George Nash, I don't know, we really run out of time. I do think film and culture as it affects the love of America is maybe not a bad idea one day for its own webinar for the Center for Civil Society. So we'll hold off on that. I do want to first remind our viewers, first, thank you for participating to Bill, David, and Jonathan. For folks who have joined us, thank you for taking the time. I hope you found this edifying and educational and hopefully inspiring. And again, www.Center for Civil Society. You will find links to the many things we're doing, including our next webinar in October, and also our conference in Scottsdale. Mostly, again, that's mostly donor directed, but do check it out. The American Philanthropic and Center for Civil Society has all kinds of webinars, master classes. It's doing great things. We believe fervently, everyone I work with here believes we need to strengthen civil society. Without a strong civil society, this experiment, this great experiment, this last great hope of Earth is not going to become the more perfect union it can become. So with that said, again, I thank you, gentlemen, for participating, and thanks all for watching, and we'll be back soon with another webinar. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.